right now. I still don't feel as though you can say it's like big business, because when I think of big business, I think of like the pharmaceutical industry, movie industry, etc. Sure, some of the esports games in terms of the casual players are getting numbers approaching that kind of level, but I don't really know that they're quite there. But it's certainly much, much bigger business than it was before. It seems to be an ever-growing business if we just take the cumulative total of esports, not the ebbs and flows of each individual esport and its games and leagues and tournaments and viewership. But it's now the case that what makes it more significant is it's becoming the case that esports directly are bigger business. No longer is it just the case that a multiplayer function of a game is already a side component that's lesser. And then within that niche, you've got the smaller niche of the people who play esports and watch esports and care about esports. Now, just esports outright is becoming one of the main functions of a game, if not the game in certain particular cases. Hence, we have lots of developers out there trying to make multiplayer games, trying to make specifically esports titles in certain cases, or at least integrating this concept and trajectory into their plan when they make and publish a game. And as such, everyone in the esports industry is searching for the next big game. And oftentimes we see things hailed or lauded or predicted to be the next big game that may not in fact become the next big game, or may not pan out that way, or they started out great but then the trajectory just fell off a cliff and they were replaced by something else, or they were proven to be a fad, just some social phenomenon, a little snowball within gaming culture that seemed to take a ripple in esports but then fell back again. But the reason why everyone's searching for this next big esports game is not just because it's going to be big business, they're going to make a lot of money, but potentially they can make even more money. Potentially they can get even more exposure, but maybe they can ride the next big game into the mainstream, as you see people trying to kind of shoehorn with Fortnite, that any success Fortnite has as a casual game, or with Ninja, or with Drake getting involved, that somehow spells that the esports side is the next big thing. And what they're really trying to tell is they're not trying to tell you or I that it's the next big game. They're not interested in convincing us. They're trying to convince some guy who's going to invest millions of dollars that's the next big game. They want to line their pockets and they want to be first in line at the trough to taste from all that new slop, I guess, in terms of the investment money. Now, part of the past of big esports games and titles, though, is not as well known, really, because people would naively think, when they think of the big game developers, Valve Software, Blizzard, in the past, id Software, Riot Games, they would think, right, well, these people made an esports game and they must have a handle on what esports games are like. But if you look, the past of big esports titles comes from mods, modifications. The big games of the past, all their successors, all came from modifications. So the present of esports is mods, just like the past is. Look at the current crop of top games, as we will in a minute, and you'll see they are all either mods or have a history in a mod, and none of them are the original game or the first within a genre or kind of style of game, style of aesthetic even. Now then, that will then lead to the question, is the future mods? If the past and the present are mods, shouldn't mods feature into the future somehow? But that's where we get into a tricky area, though. And there's the aspect of closed systems and people who own the IP rights before you've made the game, which later on might become a bigger game than their original game. That's going to be a tricky area. So first of all, what are mods? For anyone who's just heard the term, they're not entirely familiar. Mod stands for modifications. It basically means you take an existing game title, you use a developer kit, which typically has been provided by the game developer, so that the community people can create resources for the game. Oftentimes, it might initially just be a map maker or something, so you can make a new map, a new level for the game, but oftentimes there are options within it to actually modify the game on a greater level than that and actually make what might appear like an entirely new game or a totally reskinned game that has a totally different theme. So if your original game was shooting demons, now whatever, you're firing off flowers and bubble pops and you're shooting cartoon characters, you can do all these things, or you can use that to build the story and make it a totally different story. If it was a zombie game at one point in time, now it's a game where you're in the Wild West, or it's a game where you're in the future on a space station. It was a way to allow the imagination of the community and other people, but someone who couldn't make a game from scratch, didn't have the resources or the, literally in terms of the tools, or the resources in terms of the money and the time, but wanted to take an already existing engine in that aspect and make a game themselves. Now, in the early days, part of this also stems from the fact that people like id Software wouldn't just make a new game. They were making cutting edge technology with their 3D graphics engines. And so they already wanted to license the engine to rival companies who couldn't make a new engine like that, or it would cost a lot in research and development. development, and therefore they'd sell the engine to you, license it, and you'd make your own shooter on top of that with a different aesthetic and different rules and physics, etc., but it'd run on their engine. Now, within that world, the geniuses behind Doom and Quake from id Software, so John Carmack, John Romero, these guys also wanted the community to have the option to be able to make different modes of the game and variants and other aspects. Now, they didn't foresee what would come out of it, that some of these would become their own game, sometimes bigger than Quake and Doom now, and their own esports titles. No one could have known that back then. It was a way to let the community and other people get involved, because these guys, people like John Carmack, John Romero, they came from a world in which things were available for other programmers. Back then, that's one of the terms that hacker used to mean before it meant breaking into computers. It's people who were interested in programming and clever ways of doing things, and people would share each other's code and resources, because why would we all want to reinvent the wheel every single time? This was part of the aesthetic that computer gaming culture, because of computer culture, came out of in the 70s and the 80s with the Homebrew Computer Club and all these sorts of things. And so it was kind of hearkening back to a heritage, a tradition that goes far, far back in computer programming. And these were kind of the new guns, the young guns of that kind of prestige and tradition in the modern era. Now, obviously, one of the issues that I brought up before with mods, though, is because you're giving someone a developer kit to modify your game, the way that IP rights work, which already are a tricky area when it comes to games, and especially esports games, typically meant that the standard developer kit that you got from an id Software, a Valve Software, whoever it might be, meant that they either had ownership over whatever you created, like you couldn't just sell that as a game and make it your own game, or they had some sort of a right to like be the first person to buy the game, or often in the early days this wasn't even an issue. You just tended to hire the person who made the game, like when they hired Gman, who made Counter-Strike to Valve Software, and then it wasn't an issue and they had the rights there to make the game themselves and to continue on to make all the money from at that point in time. Because one of the reasons that this has been tricky is, first of all, it means there's not as much incentive beyond making a cool or mod, a fun thing for me and the rest of the community, for me to put all my effort into making something cool out of your game. And so what you've seen instead is, in the modern day, it hasn't been direct mods as much as people who'd worked on the mod tend to then go and cash in by getting a big game development studio, often a rival esports company in terms of overlapping into the esports space, but still being a game developer first and foremost, who tend to hire that person, the visionary behind the mod, and say, right, make a sort of similar game, but with enough differences that we don't get sued, and you'll make that game for me, and we'll try and make all the money. And hence, we've seen similar concepts developed elsewhere. I mean, one of the most clear examples of this, and one that actually ended up having a big impact on the industry, was the sort of gold rush of developers who, when Dota became a pretty big game, and it had been around for 3 or 4 years, but wasn't a big esports title, it was very much a secondary title, but had sort of big cult following within esports circles of people who played it as their casual game from their time off Counter-Strike or Quake or StarCraft or Warcraft or whatever it might be. You had this gold rush of developers, other development studios who weren't Blizzard games, who were in a rush to get people like IceFrog, who ended up being involved with many of these titles, or other people who could make a similar type of game. And everyone rushed to see who could make a game like that and see if it could get successful and who would become number one. So we had League of Legends and Heroes of New Earth and Dota 2, obviously, eventually. Remember, this is the thing people always forget. Dota 2 is not directly connected to Dota. Dota is Defense of the Ancients, whereas Dota 2, Valve Software will be very clear to tell you that's not Defense of the Ancients 2. That's a game just called Dota 2. It's just, happenstance, isn't it? They have very similar names in that respect, because, again, they're trying to make a game that's sort of the same and cash in on that and make that the new development trajectory, whatever, evolutionary path, but without connecting to the original one, because they'd owe the IP rights to someone like Blizzard at that point in time, or someone involved with the mod and Blizzard. It'd be very complicated, right? So we saw that battle for hierarchy in that sense. And obviously, overall, League of Legends has won out in terms of being the bigger game and probably making more money. So let's think of the past of esports in this sense of mods. And some of you will be surprised by how many games have either direct path to a mod or a kind of spiritual successors to a mod. So you start off with Quake. Now, when Quake comes out, it's obviously one of the first fully 3D FPS games, first-person shooters. It's basically the birthplace of what I think of esports. There were Doom competitions, but it didn't have the same sort of exposure on the internet because the internet itself wasn't really developed. So Quake really was the first one, and then Quake 2 only a couple of years later. These were the games that launched esports. In fact, as I always joke, at the time there wasn't esports. It was just people who played Quake. That's what we used to call it, Quake. So obviously Quake Quake 2 particularly had its own mods, and one of those mods was Action Quake 2. And this was a game which took Quake 2 and it made it sort of like a terrorist type themed game. And the person who made this, or was involved with the development at some point, was a man called Gman. And he then later on went on to make Counter-Strike. So Counter-Strike is a spiritual successor to Action Quake 2, which is a mod of Quake 2. Now, here's the thing though, because Counter-Strike itself isn't a mod of Quake or Quake 2. Counter-Strike itself is a mod of Half-Life. But Half-Life is a game which licensed the engine of the first Quake and made a game, Half-Life, totally different aesthetic, sci-fi game. And a mod of Half-Life was Counter-Strike, which obviously now leads to Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Counter-Strike Source beyond that. And generally, it's a massive esports game and has been throughout the history of esports from about 2001 onwards. Then we go back to Quake again, the original Quake. Original Quake, a mod for that game was Team Fortress. Now, again, Team Fortress had its own different spiritual successor in Team Fortress Classic, which was made for Half-Life, again, itself a licensed engine of Quake. And Team Fortress was an underground game, but it had its own popularity back in the days when I played Quake. It's just that the entire scene, even people who played normal Quake, was very, very small. Obviously, Team Fortress, then under Valve with Team Fortress Classic, becomes Team Fortress 2 later on. Again, a game that has a cult following, but wasn't really a big esport. Well, what's the reason why I'm bringing this up now? Because that would seem like a bit of an abstract one, right? Well, because Team Fortress clearly leads into a game by Blizzard Software, Overwatch, right? How can this not be called a spiritual successor to Team Fortress? It contains some of the same concepts. I don't think it's any coincidence that so many of the Overwatch pros came over from Team Fortress 2, and it wasn't people from Quake or Counter-Strike or other games typically who were coming over. It was largely those people, especially the Western players. You look down teams like Houston Outlaws, Dallas Fuels, these are littered with players. I think Florida Mayhem. These are teams littered with players who are coming from the Team Fortress 2 scene because that's the game they see kind of as the next chain in the evolution. Then you obviously think as well in Half-Life, not just Counter-Strike, but another game that was quite popular around the time Counter-Strike as a mod came out was Day of Defeat, whereas Counter-Strike was a terrorist, counter-terrorism themed mod, tactical shooter, Day of Defeat was a World War II themed mod, tactical shooter, and it had its own time where it had online success in Cal Invite, just like Counter-Strike did in America. It had a few LANs, a few CPLs, but it never took off as a massive game, partly because Counter-Strike was taking up all the resources and the space and the attention at that point in time, and it was a very, very limited sort of ecology where you couldn't really have multiple games like that, and people couldn't afford to send 6-man, 5-man teams around the world if they're already doing it for Counter-Strike, which is a bigger game. But Day of Defeat, while there isn't a direct chain to these future games, Day of Defeat was also an aesthetic which some of the players who played that came out of that game and played the early Call of Duty games. Now, funnily enough, Call of Duty at the time, I remember as a PC game. I had people I knew from Day of Defeat, people from Counter-Strike pros who were playing Call of Duty in the early days, and it wasn't that dissimilar to kind of a hybrid between Day of Defeat and Counter-Strike, like some of the elements of it, and it had also some almost like Quake-type physics to some of the aspects of it. Now, obviously, they developed that, and that became much more of a casual game, and in fact now is more traditionally associated with console gamers, but there's a spiritual succession there to some degree from Day of Defeat to Half-Life to Quake if you keep going back far enough. Then you go and you look at a game like Dota, League of Legends, Dota 2, Heroes of the Storm. These games all go back to Dota, Defense of the Ancients, which was a mod, it was originally just a map, of Warcraft 3, which is obviously the RTS game most famously made, third in the series by Blizzard. And Dota was a little mod within that people were playing this map and had a custom way of playing it. And it gradually developed as a community game. Never became a big esports game itself. Had a small esports scene, much, much smaller than games like Counter-Strike or later StarCraft 2. In Warcraft 3 was significantly bigger and a much bigger pro scene and exposure. But then we obviously had League of Legends became a massive game. Dota 2 became a big game, I would say, with a cult following, but not a huge esports game overall in the same sense. Heroes of the Storm hasn't been quite as big. Games like Heroes of New Earth had their time. Games like Smite have often been on the side and had their own sort of like sideways success, but never quite cracked into the mainstream of esports titles. And obviously, most recently, you have all these battle royale games. Now, for these ones have barely really made any sort of overlap or penetration into the esports side of things. So I'm not particularly versed on them myself. So I don't actually know which ones came first. But obviously, at the moment, everyone's going off about Fortnite. But Previously, before that, PUBG was the big one. And then you go back further than that, okay, still smaller and much less even chance to break into esports. You have the games that got very big from streaming, like H1Z1, you have DayZ, etc. These games where you're in a big world, there's a bunch of you, it's sort of like a huge deathmatch, there's lots of different weapons, you spend your time going around, you mainly tend to look in third person, you can work in teams, there's like a slow element, but then it has a pace component to speed the game up so that everyone's not just camping all the time. You know, this is a new type of game, and certainly in terms of the casual gaming aspect and the multiplayer aspect, it's been very successful. It's still yet to fully find its way to be integrated or to push into esports, and no one knows yet whether it will. So when people are looking for that next big game, the funny thing is people tend to get caught into the paradigm that they're already in within esports. So just as there's that famous line by, I think it was like Henry Ford, where he said something like, if I'd asked my customers what they'd wanted, because obviously famously he made the Ford car, they'd have just said faster horses. That's basically what people in esports tend to do, actually. There's the two groups of people. There's the one group of person who understands the esports game that's out now and kind of can see the mechanism of how it got to where it is. And they often naively think, right, what we need like a better version of Counter-Strike, or a game that could beat Counter-Strike and be better than it in some other respects or some other features, and that'll take over from Counter-Strike. And they look for a Counter-Strike beta or a League of Legends beta, or they look for a Warcraft, StarCraft beta, again, that's going to defeat them. That's actually what people originally thought with Quake. When Quake came out and became this phenomenon, there was tons of people making first-person shooters that they wanted to defeat it. Duke Nukem Forever, 3D, etc. All these other games that are out there that people thought could take over from it. And generally they didn't really, because that's actually the interesting thing. It tends to be that the next big esports game is either a game that existed already, but had never had the right game within it to make it a big esports game. So it's never been a big esports game, but has a past, or it's an entirely new game type. And therefore the next top big esports game tends to be a new genre, either coming into existence or rising up. And so it tends to be more of like a black swan phenomenon, where you can't say, right, well, we've seen this, and then this level goes to level 1 to level 2 to level 3. So, right, the obvious success point next is going to be level 4 of this type of progression, and that's going to be the next big thing. No, it tends to be that while you're going level 1, 2, 3, suddenly out of nowhere, something totally new comes along and overtakes everything and is the new game type and is a phenomenon of its own right. Hence, nobody generally has been able to predict these things. So you look at the new big game and go back over the history of esports, and you'll see how it is different genres rising up, and then different games within that genre, sometimes not even the first or the best, but the one that takes over. So obviously the first one, like I said, there was no esports, it was Quake. So at the time, we had Quake, and then, to give it credit, simultaneous to that, because obviously especially the Korean scene from 2000 onwards was very vital in terms of esports and had its own sort of parallel development. So you have in the West, you have first-person, what they're called arena shooters now, so Quake, Unreal, deathmatch type games, and then over in Asia primarily, you had the RTS games, real-time strategy games, so StarCraft Brood War was the original one, then you had Warcraft 3. These were the first big games. And again, it's two genres coming up, first-person arena deathmatch shooters and RTS games. After that, a few years later, along comes Counter-Strike. Well, Counter-Strike's not really a deathmatch game primarily, it's a team-based game. It's also not really deathmatch and arena shooter in terms of like fast movement and crazy weapons and a fantasy theme. No, it's tactical-based, team-based tactical shooters, how I've heard people often describe it. So that comes along and it completely displaces Quake. And it displaces to some degree Warcraft 3 even as the biggest game. And so now you have a new game type that comes along. Well, what game comes along and truly displaces Counter-Strike as the next big game? Well, you could either say it was StarCraft 2 and a return of the RTS, but in a different form, or you'd say it would be a MOBA or an arts game, right? It would be something like League of Legends, Dota 2. These are the games that came along and became the next big game and got all the attention and became what people were watching and wanting to play. But these games have no connection to team-based tactical shooters or first-person shooters in arena deathmatch games, or even directly RTS, even though they come from mods of those, because they're obviously a very different genre where you have the 5 players and they're a team, but they have elements of what were like the heroes in Warcraft 3, but there's no minions in the same sense. There's minions you just farm, but they're not part, you don't have an army in the same way. They're very different games overall, and they're very different game mechanic as to what people are enjoying. So what came after this sort of a game? Well, in more recent times, you'd have to say something like Overwatch. At least in terms of casual games, it became the big esports game. Hasn't quite made it as an esports game to number one yet. Well, sure, they have a connection. Overwatch has a connection back spiritually a bit looser than some of these other games, to Team Fortress, and then back into Team Fortress Classic and the original Team Fortress and Quake, but none of those games were ever the biggest game or ever close to it. In fact, if you'd have told someone 10 years ago, or roughly whenever Team Fortress 2 came out, right, this game will actually have a spiritual successor, which will actually be much more cartoony and almost like kids-like, you know, and it will actually be bigger than this game. In fact, it will be one of the biggest esports games. And in terms of esports, and especially one of the biggest casual games, it will actually end up getting more money put into it than any other game before. People will say you're crazy. And in fact, the fact that you're going to go fantasy element means probably even less likely because, you know, Counter-Strike's the big game now. So people like it to be more realism-based and tactical. And, you know, Team Fortress has these elements and we've got the war theme, etc. People would never believe you. Likewise, Battle Royale coming up. This is nothing like anything we've seen before. Sure, it has some elements of a death match, but it's so different from that because it blends it with the realism component and then Fortnite takes it into a fantasy element. Again, obviously, we've had revivals along the way. Like I say, like we had Warcraft 3, revived sort of the RTS genre. StarCraft 2 revived the RTS genre. CSGO revives Counter-Strike after a couple of years of LoL and dropping down the rankings to second or third big esports game. Dota and League of Legends obviously come along and revive the concept of a cult game Dota into the biggest game in the world. And as I said, Overwatch takes the Team Fortress sort of seeds that are along there and makes them fully blossom into something huge that's an esports game. Now, what's interesting about this is, as with many other areas that involve markets and marketing and how you create a community and development mechanisms and who comes up with a feature first, it's not always about being the best even in the new genre. So it's not like you can figure out the new genre and become the best in that and make it, because I would argue Dota 2 in almost every respect I think is actually a better game than League of Legends, except for casual fans to play. And that's why I understand why League of Legends is overwhelmingly more successful. If you look back in the day when I was a youth, the PlayStation came out, and the PlayStation came out at the same time roughly as the Sega Saturn. Now the Sega had been a very, very successful format when they'd had the Mega Drive, the Genesis, because the previous big consoles were the Sega Genesis, Mega Drive, and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And then obviously PlayStation was going to be a CD add-on to, I think it was going to be the Nintendo 64, and instead they broke off, made their own. PlayStation ended up winning out the battle, not just against Sega, someone who had much more experience and actually in some degrees made a better machine. It had better technical capabilities, but it was harder to program. They didn't have the same resources, didn't get the same marketing push or tap into the same undercurrent. So that failed almost outright. Then the N64, which was a couple of years later, a much, much better machine in some regards, didn't have the CD playability, obviously, it had cartridges instead, but technologically far ahead of the PlayStation, had its own cult following, and it had some success, but it wasn't close to number one. The PlayStation outstripped it. VHS versus Betamax is obviously the classic one, because most people now only know that VHS existed. In fact, they don't even know about cassettes anymore, but supposedly Betamax had its own technological advantages, but lost out the battle. Part of the reason why this problem is going to exist, especially in esports, is you have the difficulty of, on the one hand, making a great game for hardcore fans and very skilled and therefore lending itself to esports. And you have the difficulty of, on the other hand, having a game that's very fun and very easy to understand for casuals, which is what we used to call noobs, quite frankly, but casuals, the more polite term, I guess. Now, the real issue, this is an issue, is you would want ideally to have both, but that tends to get you in a no man's land in the middle. So it tends to be that games fit more into one direction or the other. They either are very, very good for hardcore fans. You think of games like, I think an obvious example would be something like Dota 2, fantastic for hardcore players and for esports side of things. Doesn't do as well as casuals with League of Legends. But then again, League of Legends, fantastic for casuals and for fun. But for the esports side of things, I think somewhat limited because of what makes it great for casuals. You just end up in this scenario where making the crossover doesn't really always seem to be possible. So getting a game that's really good for casuals to cross over an esports side of things, so Overwatch, PUBG, Fortnite, that's kind of tough to do. You can't always do it. Riot's done it to some degree, but they also did it with some of the biggest numbers and pumping money in themselves. Then you look at the games that are very good in hardcore. How do you get them to be the biggest games for the casuals and have the most attention? It seems somewhat difficult to do. There's no real solution to making that bridge there. It can't really artificially always be done. So what is the future? Because if you look at the past and the present, the future should be mods still. This should be the breeding ground of the next big esports game and genre. Problem is, developers want to own these games. They want to have the IP rights to them. And so Funnily enough, developers themselves could have been much more inhibitive and restrictive themselves in the past if they'd known more about esports and cared more about it. Because think of some of the examples where most of the modern esports games could have been owned by a different developer. They could be the one raking in all the money. So if you want to go in the most extreme sense, now this is the most implausible one, id Software to some degree could have had a game like Counter-Strike because they had Quake 2, and Action Quake 2 came out of that, and if they'd have embraced the mod scene and sort of put resources into it, maybe they could have developed a Counter-Strike for their game. Instead, because Valve had licensed the engine for Half-Life, and that's where Counter-Strike came from, Valve gets Counter-Strike instead. And you have to think how much the esports industry would have changed without Valve having Counter-Strike when you consider what happened with Steam, etc. Then you consider, on some low level, id Software could have had Team Fortress, and to some degree what's sort of become Overwatch, because Team Fortress was a mod for Quake World, the first Quake, and that later on led to the other versions of Team Fortress, and then obviously long time down the line, something like an Overwatch. Again, you'd have to be incredibly prescient to be able to see that these things could happen, but these people didn't put much effort into developing the mods once the person originally made them. Then probably the most startling one, and one of the ones I know they wish they could get back, is Blizzard and Dota. Because remember, since Blizzard made Warcraft 3, and Dota was a modification of Warcraft 3, Blizzard could have had Dota. They could have been the ones making Dota 2. League of Legends comes out of Dota. These other games are all based on Dota that are in that MOBA/arts format. So instead, what does Blizzard end up with? Well, they end up with Heroes of the Storm. They don't have League of Legends or Dota 2. They really messed that one up and let something go. But then again, they got Overwatch later on. And you know what? They have their own games. So it kind of evened out for them. The problem is this. You need mods, and you need it to be wide open in terms of development because it gives you more chances for something good to be made. It's like when you want a different map or a game type within an esports title. If you just have a game developer sit down and create it, it's almost impossible to reverse engineer a great map or a great concept like that. What you have to do is you have to have as many people as possible take a crack at it, and then when some good ones happen to just emerge organically out of that, we pick those as the new maps, as the new game types. So you need lots of people to have this opportunity. You need things like mod tools and modding communities to make different game modes, different variants, to maybe even revive an old game type that hadn't been successful in a different aesthetic or with a different mechanism that makes it a new popular game. But instead, will that happen, or will it just be game developers paying that guy to come and make a new game for them that's a spiritual successor, or someone making a copycat type and theirs happens to tap into something in marketing or a fun different aspect to it, or maybe makes it easier and more palatable for casual fans, and therefore that becomes the next big game and it hits at the right time. A final detail I want to add here, which would have changed everything for mods and might yet change the future, is something I saw people discussing on Twitter, and it was particularly Melk made this point, the guy who's one of the head people at Infinite, who are the people behind Optic Gaming and the Houston Outlaws. And his point was, what would happen if an open source game came along? So if those standard developer toolkits in the past hadn't just been where you still had an IP right or some sort of ownership, if they'd have been anyone who makes a game with this owns it, now you would have been in a totally different world, because now there wouldn't have been these battles over the esports games. Now you could have had tons of different esports genres and games created within them. You might not have had the same people pick up the strain. People might have been battling for each other's titles, each other's mods within or someone else's game title. That might have been a way to farm up esports games now. But if you were to make one that was fully open source, so you make the game, but at this point in time, anyone can do anything with it. I made the game and I make the money from the game and people who buy it, but I don't have IP right control over the game and the esports side of the game in the same way. Anyone who wants can come along, modify it, or can use it for a tournament, or can sell broadcast rights within their tournament from that. And they don't have to answer to me, and they can run it. And it's a totally open market with no one restricting or controlling any element. That would blow the industry of esports wide open, because all current options of possibilities to make money would not just be available, they would be available to everyone and anyone. Now, the reason why you would think that couldn't happen, you couldn't have an open source game like that come along and it wouldn't make it, is because from about 2010 onwards, the barrier to having your game be an esports game is not just that it has to have a lot of people playing it. That was already the case that made games grassroots games back in the past, like Counter-Strike, like StarCraft 2. It's also been, and like Dota, obviously, it's also been the factor that from about 2010 onwards, you needed to get in with the people who organize the tournaments, unless you're going to run your own leagues. You need to get in with the tournament organizers, and they want you typically to provide the prize pool. If you do that, they'll run the tournaments and you'll both work initially hand in hand to build an esport from this game. So that meant you had to have a big marketing budget of probably millions of dollars to pay for these tournaments. So an open source game, you might think naively, won't have that, because even if the guy makes a lot of money off the game, like it just goes, I mean, obviously Minecraft isn't like that as far as I know, but if he made like Minecraft level numbers, yeah, he'd have the money to blow on that. But even then, would he? Would he put it into that? Would he see a way he'd make the money back? Maybe not, right? But you think of some of the things that have come along since 2010, and there are options for this, because now you have crowdfunding. Now you have items people could buy in the game, which a percentage could go to providing this fund, which would fund tournaments and would fund the esports side of things. So think of if a Minecraft of esports came out, a game that came out of nowhere and it blew up and took over the whole world, but then it had Dota 2 and League of Legends and Overwatch style funding of items and crowdfunding pools to make it then a big esport at the same time, but then the industry could do whatever they wanted with it. Now, this is just an interesting line of potential I thought I'd open up here, but the bigger concern for me is what will happen with the modding community, because we see how esports really has cannibalized these mods and gone back through its own garbage and refuse, as it were, looking for these types and people creating new variants of that mod that then, when it hits at the right time and with the right features now enabled, makes it a huge thing. Obviously, without streaming, things like Battle Royale wouldn't even have taken off in the first place, wouldn't have had these games get to this size. If the casual games of something like Overwatch wasn't as huge and make as much money, maybe they wouldn't attempt to make an esports side of things, just as people like Counter-Strike, Valve wasn't putting a lot of money into these things or developing it, letting other people do these things. So mods were the past of esports. They're certainly the present of esports. Will they be the future of esports? This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing. But I've graduated from that mindset, and now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.